And there you go, guys.
Ready? Hi, this is Paul Drabik with Gateway Pundit. I'm also co-host on Behind Enemy Lines podcast. I'm here with Alderman Raymond Lopez of the 15th Ward of the City of Chicago. And Terry and I just spoke at the Police and Fire Commission in downtown Chicago, and we were addressing the illegal immigration issue. I want to commend Alderman Lopez because he's put forth an amendment, and they're going to be voting on it tomorrow, correct? Alderman Lopez, can you describe that amendment to us as it pertains to illegal immigration and the city of Chicago, and we'll go from there.
Sure. So first off, welcome to the 15th Ward. What the City Council hopefully will be voting on tomorrow is an amendment to the Welcoming City Ordinance, which is basically the sanctuary city laws, that reinstitutes some of the carve-outs, the exceptions when our police department can in fact work with our federal authorities when individuals who are undocumented choose to engage in specific dangerous criminal activity. What we are proposing is that if an individual chooses to engage in criminal activity that involves drug crimes, gang-related crimes, prostitution, human trafficking, or sex crimes involving minors, that we should not be giving them refuge or safe haven in the city of Chicago. That our police officers should be able to reach out to ICE, Tom Holman, and say, we have one of your targets, here you go, and let them deal with it.
So this is an important point, right? Because what Terry and I have done is we've reported on this issue extensively. The mainstream media doesn't want to seem to touch this. And I can see why, because Chicago has welcomed in an illegal immigration population, which we've uncovered has committed a lot of the crimes that you mentioned. We've uncovered through FOIA requests to the city of Chicago that illegal immigrants have committed crimes against children, sex crimes, abuse, they've committed battery, sexual assault. We've even uncovered in one instance at one of the migration facilities human trafficking. And so the other thing that we've uncovered is that the city of Chicago has spent almost $600 million on illegal immigrants, housing them, feeding them, putting them up in these facilities, and then moving them into apartments. And there's legislation that Illinois passed that would allow the landlords of these apartments to work with the state and get guaranteed funding for those immigrants. And we've seen that the city of Chicago has worked with FEMA, the federal government, and we've also seen that the Chicago federal delegation, federal congressmen, have reached out to the federal government to get funding for these illegal immigrants. Now, we see this as not a partisan issue, but I think there's a lot of Democrats in the city of Chicago and the state of Illinois who are supporting this. And we just got done talking to a constituent who said that the Democrat Party has abandoned them. She was a middle-aged African-American woman, and I've seen the people speaking at these meetings that are fed up with the city government. So, not partisan, but what do you say to the citizens of your ward that feel as though the city of Chicago has abandoned them in lieu of taking care of non-citizens?
Well, I think what we have to address is the fact that we have 52,000 individuals who came here from the border because of the fact that the Biden-Harris administration basically manipulated asylum to let everybody in. They're part of a 12 million person population that's throughout the entire United States. And yes, we've spent over 600 million last year, millions more beyond that. I think 1.3 billion if you add up all levels of government just on a small number of people. And the frustration people have is absolutely valid. Chicagoans in particular can be very generous people, but as they say, generosity starts at home, charity starts at home. Right. And we have a scenario where we literally still have people on the west side, blocks away from our mayor's home, who are struggling after a flash flood happened in 2023, July 2nd, if I'm not mistaken, 2023, and got no support from the city of Chicago. You have seniors who have furnaces that don't work through now 2 winters.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And yet when they see that we're putting people in hotels, when they're spending hundreds of millions of dollars on folks just to hear them complain about their accommodations, that is very disheartening for individuals.
Yeah.
It's aggravating, it's infuriating. And then there's the other issue of the true undocumented who are here, who've been in the city of Chicago, following the rules, following the laws, trying to make the best that they can while they wait for some sort of path to citizenship or legitimacy, being completely leaped over by our federal partners, those same members of Congress you're talking about, who have now moved on from them because, 10 years ago it was all about DACA and Dreamers.
Yeah.
And now
Yeah,
no
hear
one
about
even
it.
knows how to spell DACA.
Right.
But we all know how to spell Venezuela.
Yeah.
We know where Caracas is.
Right.
But they've all forgotten their past promises, moved on to the next latest and greatest social endeavor, which is to try and find a new constituency that's going to be dependent on them and on government services.
Dependent.
Yeah.
And that's the key word, dependent. And don't forget that in Venezuela, where a vast majority of these individuals come from, that is a dependent state where people live in. You live on the good grace of the local government there to provide all your needs, and that's what they expect here. What we have to get back to basics on is just the simple common sense of it all, right? Because in Chicago, as an alderman, I can't impact border policy directly.
Right.
I can't go down there and start enforcing border laws or building
But
border
you
walls.
have your own constituency.
But I
to
have
serve,
it. But I
right?
now have the border crisis as my backyard crisis.
Right.
And what I can do is address the issues that are in front of me, which is what this amendment does, which is how you got here. I can't address. What I can address is what you do once you're here. And if you are engaging in criminal activity once you are here, whether you are undocumented, whether you have some sort of temporary protective status, whatever your issue is, if I have a means to work with our federal partners to deal with you, then that should be the next level that I go to. And for all of my opponents who say, well, what about due process and Fourth Amendment? Consider it an upcharge in what we're charging you with, because we oftentimes see where a crime may start out locally, but then it graduates to like the FBI or some higher level of government. No one complains about that. No one complains when someone is arrested and you have other federal partners come in and bring in other jurisdictional charges to raise the stakes, if you will, when it's a criminal act. That's how we got the RICO Act.
Right.
But now all of a sudden we have apprehension and when we're dealing with matters of jurisdiction. And what I tell people when it comes to my opinion on due process, and granted I am 100% not a lawyer, but if you are in a city like Chicago committing a crime and you are undocumented or you have some sort of limited protective status here, the very first jurisdiction that deals with you should be the federal government. Because either you broke the first law to either by crossing over, overextending your visa or what have you, or you're in violation of what they gave you to have the protective status.
Right.
So the first jurisdiction isn't the city of Chicago. Your due process begins with them and ends with us.
I think that's a key point, and I think that there's an argument to be made that due process, Fourth Amendment, constitutional rights are reserved first and foremost for citizens of the country. And to your point, that if there's an illegal immigrant whose first action is the breaking of federal law, the federal government should be the ones to
First
address
crack.
that person. Right. Just a couple more questions for you. Again, I want to commend you for this amendment, for the fact that you've spoken out on this issue, and it's completely common sense for you to address it in terms of committing crimes. These individuals committing crimes, but I would say that you're in the minority in your party for being someone speaking out against this. Hopefully that tide is turning and we're moving toward some moderation in both parties.
Well, let me just say, I know that I'm in the very distinct minority when it comes to not only being someone who supports some common sense actions in government, but also in the Democratic Party when it comes to addressing this issue, because so many are trying to use this as a feeder into their messiah complex to make them feel good about government and to find a new class to be dependent upon them.
Yeah.
But for me, this is very personal. I represent these folks that people are talking about. I know what we need to do to keep undocumented people safe, where we need to focus our attention on how to bring some legalized status to them.
Mhm.
I understand all that. And, I can recognize the fact that the federal government has completely dropped the ball since Ronald Reagan was here.
Right.
But I can't go backwards.
Right.
You can't go backwards.
Right.
But what we can do is address what's in front of us. And I think that oftentimes you hear people talk about this, and what they're doing is lumping those individuals who are here or those individuals who were brought here, like the Dreamers, who basically are going about their lives following the rules,
Mhm.
more or less, with those who are choosing not to.
Mhm.
And I will tell you, there's not a day that goes by whenever I have these discussions where those individuals, those undocumented, those immigrants are not telling me that there's a target on their back because of those criminals that are in our neighborhoods.
Mhm.
They don't want to be associated with those folks. They would love to have them gone too, because it brings attention to them. It puts a mark on them unduly and unnecessarily. And if you were to tell that to any Democratic elected official, they'd look at you like you had two heads, because they don't see the difference between the people. They just see one monolithic group of, oh, that's just a group of
Right.
undocumented that we have to do everything for. And
Right.
there are some people you can help, and there are some people you just cannot.
Right. Yeah. Well, I think the term that you've been using throughout the conversation, common sense, is, this stuff is nuanced. There's variability to all of it, and there's details, and you can't take a broad brush and describe the situation with one sentence or even a paragraph.
No.
But to your point, you have constituents that have to deal with this issue on the ground, and the politicians don't seem to be recognizing that this affects people's everyday lives
Right.
in very many ways, particularly the crime that's being committed. One last question for you, Alderman Lopez. To get a little political, in terms of Mayor Johnson, his approval rating is at the basement level. We've seen constituents at City Hall complaining about this issue, and the base point is that the citizens aren't being represented in this sense, because there's favoritism in terms of tax dollars being shown to this class of non-citizens. But my question is, why do you think that not just Mayor Johnson, but other politicians are continuing to advocate for this issue when clearly the constituency and the support level is not there? It makes people think that people like Mayor Johnson are representing somebody else, that they're clearly not representing the citizens that they're supposed to be representing. Do you see that? Is there a group or somebody that you think that he's representing? Is it just the party as a whole? Why do you think, with his approval level where it is, that he continues to support measures that aren't popular with the people?
Well, I don't necessarily believe that anything that he's concerned about is necessarily Democratic Party related. I think it's more socialist related. And I absolutely believe that, yes, he has someone that he's concerned about, and it's the Chicago Teachers Union,
Yeah.
period.
Mm-hmm.
You could ask him about any issue going on in the city of Chicago, and he'll barely bat an eye.
Mm-hmm.
But the moment you bring up CTU, or Chicago Public Schools,
Mm-hmm.
he gets all animated, angry, starts sweating at the podium, because that's where his true passions are.
He was the former head of the.
Well, he was one of their lobbyists and organizers.
Mm-hmm.
He was a former teacher for 3 years.
Mm-hmm.
But I think that their goal is to put more children in school. They get paid as the population rises. So absolutely, after seeing decades of decline, they would love to see an infusion of new bodies who don't know any better and who they don't have to teach. Because to be fair, they're not teaching the migrant children. They're putting them in special education IEPs, labeling them as having some sort of disability, and then just basically putting them in a corner and letting them sit there for 8 hours.
Which is not doing them any
Which
service.
does them no service, because you're not even evaluated for what their educational needs were wherever they were back in whatever country they came from. But you're also not helping them acclimate to the United States. You're not teaching them English. You're not teaching them societal norms. You're not teaching them anything about even just local culture. all you're using them for is for a number in a building, and many of the schools where they put them in aren't even culturally relevant to them.
That's not assimilation.
Because
Yeah.
how can you stick 30 Venezuelan migrant children into a school in the black community that doesn't have any
Right.
faculty that speak Spanish?
But to your point, it's what it does do is it helps to grow
It grows a
the
population.
bureaucracy of the teachers union.
It grows the population. It fattens up the local schools so that you can justify why you need so many teachers in
This
there.
is interesting.
And then it allows, as more teachers that you have in a school, more dues to the union, because the union also went, 10 million into his campaign, went broke,
Interesting.
hasn't released a single audit in 3 years to show
I-
where all their
yes,
money went,
yep.
because they're flat broke, which means that is why there is such an impetus on the mayor to get rid of our CEO of CPS,
Right.
because he refused to take out those short-term loans to
Mhm.
cover those
$30 million or something?
300 million.
300 million.
Because they put in their last strike that they wanted X, Y, and Z, and they haven't been able to figure out how to pay for it
And that was a high interest loan, right?
for 1 year.
For 1 year. $300 million.
To cover union contract perks for 1 year.
And he refused. Didn't Mayor Johnson get rid of the entire,
The-
or he
actually,
they
no.
resigned on
They,
him?
they resigned. His board resigned after his administration put pressure on them to fire them, and they wouldn't do it because they know that the board members at that time would have been held personally, financially liable
Interesting.
if the CEO sued. Which is why now they did it again with a whole new cast of characters who are also being individually sued by the CEO of Chicago Public Schools. But at the end of the day, all of that is a diversion from the fact that while his heart and his energy and his puppet masters are at Chicago Public Schools and the Teachers Union, you have the $17 billion City of Chicago operation that's rudderless.
Yeah.
City services are functioning in spite of ourselves. 42%, I believe someone mentioned, of our finances go towards debt and pension obligations, which means in about 5 years we're going to be spending more on debt and pension than we do on delivery of city service. We know that our population is decreasing. We know that public safety is not something that we're known for. Bally's just said in a pro forma to attract investors that know that your market is Chicago and perception and reality of crime is real and may impact your ability to turn a profit. How do you attract business when that is what's
Right.
being floated
Right.
around you?
Right.
We know that private equity dollars is fleeing the city of Chicago, going everywhere else but St.
Illinois. It's fleeing Illinois.
But in particular, the city of Chicago, because when I think of when I was first elected, we had 64 cranes in the city of Chicago.
Right.
I think we have 2.
Let's see a lot- yeah. Not a lot of these office buildings are filled either.
Right.
Well, listen, Alderman Lopez, I really appreciate your time. I applaud your service to your community, and we appreciate your courage in speaking out, for common sense measures. So, thanks again, and
Thank you both.
we look forward to supporting you in the future.
Thank you.
Thanks.